Living means carrying an invisible weight. Day after day, the routine repeats, time goes by, and deep down, something lingers, a feeling of not being enough, a pain without a name. Behind achievements, possessions, fleeting pleasures, there's a deep silence, an emptiness that nothing fills. Arthur Schopenhauer didn't try to cover this up with promises of hope or progress. He didn't paint life with optimistic colors. To him, life is suffering. Essential, unavoidable, universal. We suffer because we desire. And for Schopenhauer, to desire is to be condemned to never find peace. With every achievement, a new emptiness shows up. With every pleasure comes boredom. The human being is trapped in a blind, relentless will that keeps pushing, but never satisfies. This view might seem dark, and it is, but it's also one of the most honest and clear insights philosophy has ever offered. In this video, you'll explore one of the most provocative and challenging ideas in history, not an invitation to easy hope, but a call to face existence as it truly is. This is Schopenhauer's world, and it begins with a simple, brutal truth. Life is eternal suffering. In Arthur Schopenhauer's philosophy, the visible world is just a representation, what appears to our consciousness. But behind that appearance lies a much deeper essence, invisible to the senses, but revealed through philosophical reflection: the will. This will is a metaphysical force that shows up in everything that lives. It's not rational or aimed at any higher purpose. On the contrary, it's blind, irrational, relentless. It drives the movements of nature, sexual impulses, hunger, the struggle to survive. It's the same force that pushes a hungry animal to hunt, a baby to cry for attention, or an adult to chase after status and power. The will is the thing in itself of the world, the only permanent thing beneath appearances. Unlike Kant, who claimed we couldn't know the thing in itself behind appearances, Schopenhauer boldly named it the will. And more than that, he said that when we look within ourselves, we don't find a divine soul, but a force that constantly wants. This wanting is the essence of who we are. And because to want is to lack, to crave, suffering lies at the center of our being. When we want something, we suffer from not having it. When we get it, we quickly get used to it and start wanting something else. Pleasure, then, is only a brief break in the cycle of pain. It's never lasting. This view goes against the optimism of modern thought and many religious traditions. Life isn't a gift, nor a journey toward happiness or fulfillment. It's an endless cycle of frustration and restlessness, driven by a will we never chose to have. This isn't just a psychological idea, it's an ontological one. Will doesn't exist only in us, it is the very being of the world. So there's no escaping it through experience. We are like leaves blown by the wind of the will. And that wind has no direction, no ethics, no end. Schopenhauer's metaphysics is deeply tragic, but it also rings true when we compare it to everyday life. Career success, romantic love, personal achievements, all promise us fulfillment. But once we get them, they just create a new void. For Schopenhauer, the promise of satisfaction is the will's greatest trap. And no one is spared from that trap, not even great geniuses or saints. Unless they somehow manage to negate the will, something we'll explore in another lesson. For now, what matters is understanding that, according to Schopenhauer, we don't live because we want to live. We live because life is happening through us. All willing arises from lack, from deficiency. Thus it is suffering as long as it is not satisfied. But no satisfaction is lasting. It only gives rise to a new desire. This perspective means that pain isn't an exception or a mistake. It's the basic structure of life. In fact, modern biology seems to echo Schopenhauer's idea by showing that all living beings are wired to survive and reproduce. Life wants to keep going, but doesn't know why. There's no final purpose, only repetition. Humans, because we're conscious, suffer in two ways. We suffer like all other creatures, And we also suffer because we're aware of our suffering. We suffer from knowing we're stuck in a cycle we can't control. This awareness of pain makes the human being, in Schopenhauer's view, the most tragic of all animals. But this isn't meant to lead to despair. It's meant to bring clarity. For Schopenhauer, seeing the will as the essence of the world is a key step toward breaking free of illusions. Illusions like the idea that the world is just, that suffering has a purpose, or that we are free to shape our own destiny. He's not saying we should give up all hope, but he urges us to stop projecting reason or meaning onto a world that simply doesn't have them. The world isn't guided by logic. It's ruled by an unconscious, automatic, impersonal force. This idea has strong parallels with Eastern traditions, especially Buddhism, which also sees desire as the root of suffering. Schopenhauer was one of the first Western philosophers to acknowledge this connection. Although his response is more philosophical than practical, he doesn't suggest meditation or retreats, but a contemplative, critical, and disillusioned attitude toward life. Of course, this theory meets resistance. Western tradition, shaped by Socrates, Christianity, and the idea of progress, tends to value optimism. But Schopenhauer confronts that optimism head-on, calling it childish or self-deceptive. Optimism is not only absurd, it is also deeply immoral. The world isn't good by nature. It's a battleground of forces where pain is unavoidable. And recognizing that is the first step toward a more honest kind of philosophy, one that doesn't deny reality but faces it head-on. So the idea that will is the essence of the world is more than an abstract concept. It's a key to understanding the human condition. We are driven by something beyond us, and that something is the root of all suffering. This understanding changes everything: how we view our desires, our frustrations, and our expectations about life. Instead of chasing happiness in external goals, maybe it's time to rethink the act of desiring itself. And that leads directly to the next lesson: desire as the root of suffering, where we'll dive deeper into how this inner mechanism traps us even more in the cycle of pain. At first glance, desire seems like the engine of life. From the moment we wake up to the second we close our eyes, we're always wanting something: to finish a task, get a message, hit a goal, feel loved, get some rest. But according to Arthur Schopenhauer, this constant drive, this urge toward what we don't yet have, is exactly what causes human suffering. For him, desire isn't something to be celebrated. It's an existential trap. And there's no easy way out, because desire isn't a choice. It's built into our very consciousness. We're doomed to want, and that's why we're doomed to suffer. All willing springs from lack, from deficiency. Therefore, it is suffering as long as it is not satisfied. Think about it. What is happiness really? When you say you're happy, are you truly feeling joy, or just no longer feeling pain? For Schopenhauer, happiness isn't a positive state. It's just the temporary suspension of suffering. It's not something we achieve, it's just a short break, like a pause between two waves of pain. That's why every desire is a double-edged sword. It promises fulfillment, but delivers anxiety. While we desire, we suffer from the lack of what we want. And when we finally get it, we hardly enjoy it, because another desire quickly takes its place. That's the cruel nature of the cycle of wanting. It never ends. It's a non-stop loop of craving and short-lived relief. It's like hunger. You eat, feel full for a while, but soon you're hungry again. The difference is that human desire goes far beyond basic needs. It multiplies, gets more complex, hides in new forms. We want love, recognition, safety, pleasure, meaning. But even when we get these things, they soon feel normal. What once seemed essential becomes just another part of life. And from there, a new, bigger, more distant desire is born, and the suffering starts all over again. That's why, for Schopenhauer, life swings between two types of pain: the pain of lacking and the boredom of having. When we don't have what we want, we suffer because we're missing something. And when we do have it, we suffer because it no longer means anything. Life moves between restlessness and emptiness, two sides of the same suffering. Life swings like a pendulum between pain and boredom. This may sound dark, but it rings painfully true when we take an honest look at ourselves. How many times have we believed, once I get X, I'll finally be happy, only to realize that nothing really changed once we did? Modern consumer culture runs entirely on this loop of desire and frustration. We're constantly bombarded with messages that make us feel incomplete, inadequate, lacking. Every product, every experience promises to fill that hole, but it never does, because the hole isn't a bug. It's part of who we are. Later, Freud would expand on this idea with his theory of drives and repetition. But Schopenhauer gave this pattern a much deeper twist. There is no way out of suffering as long as we desire. The only real escape, he says, would be to suppress desire itself, something we'll explore in a later lesson on the denial of the will. For now, what matters is understanding that this endless chase for satisfaction doesn't make us more alive. It just makes us more restless. Today's culture insists that desire is a sign of ambition, passion, and health. But through Schopenhauer's lens, desire is actually a symptom, a sign of a soul in turmoil, trapped in a cycle it can never escape. And this applies to every area of human life. In love, desire hides behind romance, but is really about the will's blind push for reproduction. In careers, we chase success, status, and respect, and feel crushed when the world doesn't reward us as we hoped. Even in spirituality, we desire enlightenment, but still fall into the trap of wanting to be special, saved, different. Nothing escapes the logic of wanting, and so nothing escapes the pain it brings. Schopenhauer doesn't condemn desire like a moral preacher. He's not saying it's wrong to want. He's saying it's unavoidable, and that suffering is unavoidable because of it. This isn't an ethical judgment. It's an ontological one. He's talking about the very structure of human existence, not about right or wrong choices. That's why suffering isn't a mistake to be fixed. It's a truth to be recognized. Most philosophies and religions teach that suffering can be overcome. Schopenhauer goes the other way. He says there's no lasting happiness as long as we desire. That's one reason he's often compared to Buddhism, which also sees desire as the source of suffering, though it offers more direct practices for escaping it. Schopenhauer, on the other hand, believes that simply seeing through the illusion of desire can bring clarity, even if not happiness. In other words, once we realize that to desire is to suffer, we stop putting all our hope into unreachable goals. We start seeing life more clearly, and with fewer illusions. This may sound harsh, but it's also freeing. Once we understand that the root of our pain lies within us, not in other people or the world, we stop blaming everything around us for our frustration. Suffering isn't a punishment from fate. It's the price we pay for existing as beings who want. Pain is essential to life. That's why to desire is already to be wounded. You might be wondering, is there any way to desire without suffering? For Schopenhauer, the answer is no. As long as there's desire, there will be pain. What we can do is recognize the game, refuse to be fooled by it, and maybe start looking for ways to rise above it. Art, contemplation, compassion, and asceticism are some of the paths Schopenhauer will explore in upcoming lessons. But the first step is this: to understand that desire is suffering. And the more we desire, the more we trap ourselves in the illusion that something outside of us will finally make us whole. We live in a constant state of pursuit, always. From the moment we become self-aware, our eyes are set on what's ahead. We want something, we need something, we feel something's missing. And even when we get what we wanted, it doesn't take long for that restless feeling to return. That's the deepest mark of human existence, the constant sense of not being enough. Schopenhauer, with sharp clarity, draws attention to this repetitive pattern. For him, life isn't built around fulfillment, but around the ongoing drive to want. We're stuck in an endless loop. We desire, We chase, we succeed, or fail. We feel disappointed, and then we desire again. It's a circular motion, not a forward journey. We're constantly spinning around the same point: lack. A man's life turns like a mill wheel, driven by the current of his will. This image, the wheel spinning without going anywhere, isn't just a metaphor. For Schopenhauer, it's an accurate picture of the human condition. While other philosophers saw time as a straight line, a path of progress, growth, and improvement, Schopenhauer invites us to see it as a closed loop, where everything repeats: the same desires, the same pain, the same hopes. The problem isn't just that we want. The problem is that wanting never truly satisfies us. It keeps pushing us forward, but never lets us arrive. Even the things we once believed were life's great goals, love, a career achievement, a personal milestone, lose their magic once we reach them. What we thought was the end turns into just another stepping stone. And then, a new, great goal takes its place. This isn't a flaw in the system. According to Schopenhauer, this is the system. Will, the underlying force of existence, is never satisfied. Not because the world lacks something, but because will itself is a restless, endless drive. It wants just for the sake of wanting. That's how it shows up in human life, through desire. And that's why life always feels incomplete. Neither pleasure nor success can fix this. In fact, when we finally get what we want, we feel a brief relief, which is quickly replaced by boredom. And for Schopenhauer, boredom isn't just a mild annoyance. It's a glimpse into the existential void. When nothing is missing, we realize that even then, life still doesn't feel like it's enough. Life is like a pendulum, swinging between pain and boredom. This swing between suffering and boredom is the trap of existence. When we're in pain, we want to escape. When we escape, we get bored. Both come from the same cycle, the will that keeps wanting, even when there's nothing left worth wanting. It's like we're chasing a promise the world never made, but that something inside us insists must be kept. This cycle shows up in every part of life. In everyday routines, it's the constant need to keep moving. We wait for the weekend, then for vacation, then for a complete life change. Emotionally, we idealize love, get disappointed, then start idealizing again. Spiritually, we long for some ultimate meaning. And when we don't find it, we create new desires dressed up as faith. The cycle of desire is, at its core, a prison. But the most tragic part? It's invisible. It looks like freedom, the freedom to want. But Schopenhauer exposes that illusion. We're not free to want whatever we want. The desire itself controls us. It defines us, drives us. Wanting isn't something we choose. It's a force that was already inside us before we made any choice at all. That's why he says, we will never be fully satisfied, because desire creates lack. We don't feel empty because something is missing. We feel empty because desire needs us to feel that way. It builds a permanent sense of absence within us. This idea goes completely against Enlightenment optimism and modern self-help beliefs. While the mainstream says we can be truly fulfilled if we just work hard, love deeply, or follow our dreams, Schopenhauer strips it all down. All of that is just the will playing its game, and the game never ends. Every achievement leads to new anxiety. Every success brings new emptiness. We're doomed to be dissatisfied. That's the tragedy of being human. But Schopenhauer doesn't say this out of bitterness. He says it with clarity. His philosophy isn't meant to depress you. It's meant to wake you up. Wake you up to the fact that we're caught in a pattern we didn't choose. And that won't disappear just because someone tells us to stay positive. This awakening is the first step toward a deeper, more grounded awareness. An awareness that, once it sees the repetitive cycle of desire, starts to ask, is there a way out? That answer will come in future lessons. But for now, we need to recognize that pain isn't in our circumstances. It's in the very structure of wanting. And Schopenhauer challenges us to see this in our own lives. Not as some abstract theory, but as lived experience. Think about it. How many times have you believed, once this happens, everything will change? How often have you pinned your happiness on something in the future? And how many times, once you got what you wanted, did you still feel like something was missing? That's the eternal cycle of wanting, a pursuit that never ends, a hunger that can't be fed, a road that never leads anywhere. And the hardest part? It's not broken. It was built that way. The will is like a bottomless pit. The more you throw into it, the more it demands. Maybe real courage isn't about wanting harder, but about seeing desire more clearly, seeing the cycle, seeing the pattern. That in itself is a powerful act of resistance, because only then do we stop being unconscious slaves to the will and begin, even if just for a moment, to imagine what it might feel like to stop running. The eternal cycle of wanting is the prison of existence, but it's also the most honest mirror of the human soul. We live in a culture that treats pain like a problem to be solved. To suffer is seen as a mistake, a sign that something's gone wrong, that something's out of place. But Schopenhauer flips that logic completely. To him, pain is not an anomaly in life. It is life. It's not an occasional accident. It's the very structure of existence. At first, that might sound extreme. But just take an honest look at life, and you'll see what he means. From birth, we're faced with limits, losses, and disappointments. Our bodies hurt, time moves on, relationships break, dreams fall apart. Everything we hold dear, love, health, youth, freedom, is always under threat, and sooner or later, it all slips away. Pain is far more real than pleasure. Pleasure is merely the absence of a need. Schopenhauer was deeply skeptical of the idea that life is good by nature. While the optimists of his time believed the world was moving towards some better future, he insisted, the world is a place of constant suffering, and if we don't see that clearly, it's because we've been trained to stay distracted with promises, desires, and hopes that keep the illusion of some deeper meaning behind our pain alive. But for him, there is no deeper meaning. Suffering has no redemptive or moral purpose. It doesn't make us better people or prepare us for something greater. Pain, in Schopenhauer's view, is metaphysical. It's tied to the very essence of reality, which he calls will, that blind, restless, irrational force we explored in earlier lessons. And this will expresses itself as need, drive, and tension. In other words, as pain. That's why pain isn't a problem to fix. It's a presence we can't get rid of. It exists in all living things, in every layer of life. Animals suffer, children suffer, elders suffer, the wise suffer, the rich and the poor suffer. What changes is just the shape of the suffering, not the fact that it's inevitable. This diagnosis makes Schopenhauer one of the most brutally honest and most unsettling thinkers in philosophy. He doesn't try to comfort. He doesn't sugarcoat existence. His message is simple. Look at life as it truly is, full of pain, loss, and limits. Only then can we start to deal with it in a real and authentic way. He even mocks those who think pain is the exception. To him, relief is the exception. Happiness, if it exists at all, is nothing more than a break from pain, a brief pause between two waves of tension. Just like silence is only the absence of noise, happiness is just the temporary absence of suffering, not a lasting, independent state. Lasting, positive happiness is impossible. All we can have are passing moments of relief between two forms of pain. And the most brutal part of this view, it goes beyond humanity. Schopenhauer was one of the first philosophers to seriously extend this reflection to the animal world. He understood that pain isn't unique to rational beings. It's a trait of all life. Animals suffer too. They feel fear, hunger, loss, and physical pain. And they do so without being able to reason or make sense of it. So suffering isn't just about human psychology. It's a mark of being alive, a tree stretching toward the sunlight, an animal fighting not to be eaten, a human struggling to hold on to dignity, they're all caught in the same dynamic, the clash between the will to live and the pain that living brings. Life, then, is struggle. Struggle to stay alive, to protect ourselves, to satisfy desires that never truly end. And as much as we romanticize that struggle sometimes, at its core, it's a painful experience. Every win brings new tension. Every gain comes with risk. Every pleasure demands a price. That's why Schopenhauer's philosophy demands courage. Courage to look at existence without filters, without soothing stories, without illusions. Courage to admit that pain isn't a detour from life, it is the path itself. But this realization doesn't have to push us into despair. On the contrary, it can open the door to a different kind of sensitivity. If pain is something we share with every living being, then recognizing that pain is the start of compassion. It's this awareness of shared suffering that can give real meaning to ethics, something we'll explore in a later lesson. What matters now is to understand this. Pain isn't what happens when life goes wrong. Pain is the background on which everything else happens. Pleasure is rare, fleeting, and fragile. Pain is constant, universal, and structural. And this stands in sharp contrast to today's obsession with the perfect life. Social media, self-help culture, and the happiness industry sell us the idea that we can, and should, eliminate pain, as if suffering were a personal failure, not an existential condition. Schopenhauer crushes that illusion with one simple, devastating idea: to suffer is to live. Of course, this challenges us deeply. We're raised to avoid pain, to run from it, to hide it. But Schopenhauer suggests the opposite. Look at it, understand it, recognize that by accepting pain as an unavoidable part of life, we might actually find a more honest, more mature, more human way to live. Pain is essential to existence. To remove all pain is to remove its very essence. And here lies a powerful paradox. Accepting pain as inevitable doesn't mean giving up. It means stopping the cycle of false promises. It means letting go of the illusion that full happiness is just around the corner. After the next success, the next vacation, the next love. It's not. And that realization doesn't have to be depressing. It can be freeing. Because when we stop expecting life to reward us with total fulfillment, we might actually start living with more lightness, more presence, and more compassion. Pain is the rule, not the exception. And by truly understanding that, we move closer to the most honest way of being, one that accepts the weight of life without running from it, denying it, or getting lost in fantasy. We live obsessed with the idea of happiness. It's sold to us as a right, a goal, a promise, through self-help books, ads, social media, and motivational speeches. But what if that whole idea was a carefully built illusion? What if this dream of lasting, complete happiness was just a convenient invention, a mirage in the desert of life? For Arthur Schopenhauer, that's exactly what it is. He didn't deny that joyful moments exist, but he made it clear: happiness as a stable, permanent state simply doesn't exist. What we call happiness is really just a temporary pause in our suffering. Positive happiness is, at best, the ending of pain. This idea strikes right at the heart of modern optimism. The belief that with enough effort, we can reach a constant state of well-being. Schopenhauer offers the opposite view. Life is ruled by pain, desire, and lack. Any feeling of joy or happiness is just a short break, a breath between two moments of discomfort. And we see this in everyday life. When we're hungry and we eat, we feel pleasure. But that pleasure isn't something positive in itself. It's just the end of the hunger. The same goes for almost every kind of satisfaction. Sexual pleasure is the release of built-up tension. Rest feels good only because we were tired. A compliment feels nice because we were unsure of ourselves. So happiness isn't some positive thing. It's just a short pause from negativity. It's a break, a momentary gap between what hurts or what's missing. But as we saw before, Life is built on will and will never stops. That's why happiness is always short-lived, never complete, never lasting. And this is where the big mistake of optimistic thinking is exposed, especially in the legacy of Leibniz, who said we live in the best of all possible worlds. Schopenhauer sarcastically replied that if this is the best world possible, he'd hate to see one of the worst. Just take a look at human suffering: war, illness, loneliness, poverty, violence, and you'll see how wide the gap is between optimistic ideas and real life. If happiness were truly part of life's essence, it wouldn't be so rare. His critique is harsh, but necessary, because the blind chase for happiness can actually increase our pain. When we believe we should be happy all the time, and that being unhappy means we've failed, we carry not just pain, but guilt for feeling it. The myth of happiness as the ideal state creates an impossible standard, and anything less feels like failure. Schopenhauer cuts through this trap. He invites us to drop the illusion that life should be full of joy. That doesn't mean falling into despair or nihilism. It means we stop expecting life to give us something it never promised. Life wasn't designed to make us happy. It just is. And what it is tension, change, and endless desire. By accepting this, we take the first step toward a more realistic and, strangely, more peaceful way of living. When we realize that happiness isn't the norm but the exception, we stop chasing shadows. We begin to notice the small moments of relief, of beauty, of quiet, without demanding they last forever. And those moments do exist. Schopenhauer admits that sometimes the will quiets down in art, in deep aesthetic experience, or in compassion. In those moments, we're not wanting anything. We're not expecting anything. We just are. And because of that, we don't suffer. But those moments are rare, and it's their rarity that makes them so precious. So happiness isn't a goal we chase. It's something that happens when desire stops for a moment. The problem is, we almost never stop desiring. We've been trained since childhood to chase what we don't have and to ignore what we already do. This leads to a strange kind of emptiness disguised as progress. We go from one goal to the next, trying to fill a bottomless hole. And even when we get what we want, it never feels like enough. In that system, happiness becomes a constant delay, always somewhere in the future, never in the now. Schopenhauer challenges that entire mindset. He says, maybe total happiness is an illusion, but recognizing that can be freeing. When we stop demanding that life pay us in joy, we start noticing what's actually worth something. The brief break from pain, the lightness of a moment, the silence between two noises. This philosophy doesn't promise a cure, it promises clarity. It doesn't say, do this and you'll be happy. It says, you suffer because you desire, and desire is human. So when suffering stops for a little while, celebrate it. Not because you achieved happiness, but because for a moment you were spared from pain. This isn't an easy view to accept, especially in a world where happiness is everything. But maybe that's exactly why it matters so much. We're constantly bombarded with emotional pressure. Be happy, think positive, vibe higher, but what if we're not happy? What if we're just tired, sad, or disappointed? To Schopenhauer, that's not failure, it's reality. And admitting that is a sign of courage, not weakness. Because only those who accept pain as part of life can make space for a more honest kind of peace. One that doesn't come from excitement, but from embracing imperfection. Happiness belongs to those who don't demand it. Life doesn't owe us joy, but it does offer moments where pain steps back. And maybe that's enough. Maybe wisdom means no longer chasing endless happiness, and instead learning to recognize, with humility, the small moments when life gives us a break. When we hear the word pessimism, we usually think of someone with a negative outlook, someone who's given up, who believes in nothing and always sees the worst in everything. But for Schopenhauer, That's a shallow take. What he offers isn't bitter or hopeless pessimism. It's something else entirely, a radical clarity, the courage to look at life without illusions. In this context, pessimism isn't an emotional state. It's a philosophical stance. It's not about being depressed or hopeless, but about seeing reality as it truly is, without dressing up pain, without decorating life with false hopes. In other words, Schopenhauer isn't pessimistic because he gave up on life. He's pessimistic because he paid attention to it. Life is a business that doesn't cover its own costs. That sharp, ironic line sums it up. Living costs more than it gives. Pain, frustration, loss, and anxiety are constant. Pleasure, when it comes, is brief, fragile, and depends on a bunch of external conditions. When you add it all up, the math doesn't work. And recognizing that isn't about giving in to despair. It's about letting go of naivete. Naivete, for Schopenhauer, is what defines optimism. The kind of optimism that insists everything works out in the end, or everything happens for a reason, even when reality clearly says otherwise. That kind of optimism, found in the philosophy of Leibniz and the progressive spirit of the Enlightenment, is, to Schopenhauer, a dangerous form of self-deception. It keeps us from seeing the world as it really is. And what kind of world is that? A place full of pain and competition, where every living thing is fighting for space, survival, and pleasure, often at the expense of others. A world driven by will, that irrational force we explored in earlier lessons, pushing everything forward without direction, meaning, or goal. If such a world had been designed, it would border on cruel. But since there's no kind, conscious designer, there's no cruelty, only metaphysical indifference. Schopenhauer doesn't paint this picture out of bitterness. He does it out of loyalty to lived experience. He starts from real life, not comforting theories. And real life shows us, every day, that suffering is the rule, not the exception. In that sense, pessimism isn't running from life. It's facing it head-on. It's not hard to see that pain outweighs pleasure, that suffering hits harder than joy. This way of seeing things also helps us better understand what it means to be human. Optimism tends to blame the individual for their suffering. If you're unhappy, you're just not thinking positively, or you're not trying hard enough. But Schopenhauer's pessimism removes that kind of moral pressure. He tells us, you suffer because you're alive, because life is built on wanting, and wanting is by nature endless. That realization can actually bring relief, not despair. Relief in no longer needing to pretend that everything's fine. Relief in stepping off the treadmill of forced happiness. Relief in realizing that the pain we feel doesn't make us broken. It just makes us human. So pessimism isn't about giving up. It's about waking up. It's about seeing life more clearly, with fewer illusions. It's a way of thinking that doesn't rely on the bright colors of false hope, but not to fall into total darkness either. It sharpens your vision instead. Schopenhauer applied that sharp vision to history too. While many believed science and technology were signs that humanity was headed toward progress and happiness, he saw the opposite. More inventions created more desires, and more desires led to more suffering. Technology didn't end pain. It multiplied the ways we could suffer. That idea feels more relevant than ever. We live in an age of material abundance and emotional emptiness. We have more comfort, more information, more entertainment than any generation before us. And yet, we're anxious, depressed, and lost. Schopenhauer saw this coming. He understood that the root of suffering isn't a lack of stuff. It's the structure of desire itself. And no amount of technological progress can fix a problem that's metaphysical at its core. So pessimism doesn't freeze us. It prepares us. It helps us deal with impermanence, disappointment, and unavoidable pain. It tears away denial and gives us a more honest starting point. Not live to be happy, but live to understand, to endure, to care. This shift in perspective even has ethical consequences. When we realize that everyone suffers, that pain is the shared condition of all living beings, compassion is born. A kind of ethical clarity that doesn't need commandments or dogmas. It comes naturally from seeing that another person's pain is just a different version of our own. Every pain I see in someone else is a version of the pain that lives in me. Schopenhauer's pessimistic clarity, then, doesn't lead us into full-blown nihilism. It leads to a more careful, more attentive, more compassionate approach to life. There's no magical salvation, no divine promises. There is only this world, with its rare beauty and constant pain, and the courage to live in it without running to the comfort of illusions. In this way, pessimism becomes a higher form of clarity, a tragic awareness that doesn't fall for promises of some future paradise, but also doesn't collapse into despair. It stands, firm, sober, and clear-eyed, in the face of life's harshness. And that's why we shouldn't fear it. We should learn from it. In a world marked by suffering, where, as we've seen in the previous lessons, existence is driven by endless desire, and pain isn't the exception, but the rule, one inevitable question arises: how can we even talk about ethics? If life is powered by blind will, and every living being is just trying to satisfy its own needs and avoid pain, where does that leave room for caring about others? How can morality exist in the middle of this built-in selfishness? Arthur Schopenhauer gives a surprising and profound answer. Ethics begins with compassion, not with reason, not with obedience to rules, not with divine commandments, but with directly recognizing someone else's pain as something that touches me, that moves me, that calls me to act. The true foundation of morality is compassion. For him, compassion is the only honest answer in a world where suffering is at the core of everything. In a universe where every being is ruled by selfish and insatiable will, morality only becomes possible when, even briefly, I manage to pause my own wanting and put myself in someone else's place. And this doesn't happen through reason. According to Schopenhauer, reason is just a tool of the will. It figures out how to get what we want. It doesn't make us moral. Compassion isn't the result of thinking, it's a direct experience. When I see someone suffering and feel their pain as if it were mine, something in me breaks away from the natural selfishness of life. In that moment, something shifts. I stop being just me and start feeling with someone else. That shift is rare, fragile, but deeply transformative. In that moment, the individual breaks out of the cycle of selfish will. That's why Schopenhauer believes compassion is the only true foundation for ethics. Anything that comes from outside, social rules, religious laws, imposed duties, may produce obedience, but not real morality. The only authentic kind of morality is the kind that comes from recognizing the other's pain as an extension of our own. This idea stands in contrast to other famous ethical theories. Kant, for example, builds his morality on rational duty, on the idea of acting only according to rules you'd want to be universal. For Schopenhauer, that's artificial. Reason can justify almost anything. Only compassion has the real power to break the grip of selfish will. And compassion isn't selective. It's not just for the people we love or those we relate to. Schopenhauer's ethics extends to all sentient beings. Animals, for example, also suffer. They're also driven by will. They struggle to survive, and they feel pain. To deny them moral consideration is to continue a kind of species-based selfishness, a form of arrogance where reason dominates over sensitivity. A man who is cruel to animals cannot be a good man. So, real ethics isn't an abstract system. It's a way of feeling, a state of being open to the pain that surrounds us. And it doesn't need religious justification. You don't have to believe in a God who punishes or rewards. Compassion doesn't rely on heavenly promises. It comes from simply recognizing how vulnerable we all are. This kind of ethics is tragic, but also freeing. Tragic because it starts from pain, not from goodness. Schopenhauer doesn't believe people are naturally kind. The world is violent, chaotic, and ruled by irrational forces. And yet, in the middle of all that, compassion shines through, rare, precious, and even heroic. Freeing, because instead of chasing after complicated moral theories, Schopenhauer points us to something we've all felt at some point. The pain that connects us. That's the basis of morality. Not chasing happiness, but trying to relieve suffering wherever we find it. That's why he values things like forgiveness, quiet acts of help, caring for the vulnerable, respect for animals, and choosing others over ourselves. In a world built on struggle and lack, every act of compassion is a small miracle. Even more, compassion makes us more human. When we stop seeing others as threats or obstacles to our desires and start seeing them as fellow beings who suffer, something changes in us. We stop being just expressions of will, and for a moment, we rise above it. Compassion-based ethics, then, is an ethic of fragility, not of strength, domination, or pride, but of sensitivity, empathy, and listening. It's a quiet kind of morality that doesn't need to show off, and often goes unnoticed in the noise of the world. But it's what keeps everything truly meaningful in existence alive. This idea echoes teachings from Eastern traditions, like Buddhism, which also see suffering as a fundamental part of life and offer compassion as the practical response. But Schopenhauer explains it without relying on any religious dogma. He shows that compassion is what's left when everything else fails. And maybe that's exactly why it matters so much. Because in a world where pain is unavoidable, compassion is the one thing we can give each other. We can't end suffering, but we can at least not add to it. And that in itself is a deep form of ethics. Not causing suffering is more important than creating happiness. That's the foundation of his moral thought. Instead of searching for some perfect formula for universal happiness, he asks for something simpler and more real. Don't cause unnecessary pain. Care. Set your ego aside. Be present in someone else's pain. In a world driven by competition and indifference, compassion becomes an act of resistance. A way of saying, I see you, I feel your pain, and it matters to me too. That small, quiet gesture, so simple, so human, is, for Schopenhauer, where true morality begins. After recognizing suffering as a core part of life and compassion as the only ethical response to universal pain, Schopenhauer takes a radical next step. If the root of suffering is the will, and if this will expresses itself through constant desire, then the only way to escape pain is to deny the will. In other words, if desire is what drives life, and life is suffering, then the only possible redemption is the end of desire. This is what Schopenhauer calls the denial of the will, and he finds its clearest example in asceticism. The will is the root of all suffering. Denying it is the only path to true peace. But what does it actually mean to deny the will? Schopenhauer isn't saying we should become passive or indifferent, or that we can just decide to stop wanting. As we've seen in earlier lessons, the will isn't something we choose. It's the deep essence of who we are. It's in everything: our body, instincts, desires, even the drive to stay alive. So denying it is something huge. It's not about giving up one small desire, like skipping dessert or avoiding a quick pleasure. It's a radical shift in how we relate to life. A deep transformation where the person lets go of attachment to life, to pleasure, and to the need for self-importance. This isn't done out of hatred for life, but out of clarity about what life really is. The ascetic, the central figure in this view, doesn't turn away from the world out of bitterness, but out of understanding. He sees clearly that every form of desire leads eventually to frustration, pain, and repetition. So, he steps away from the game. The ascetic gives up pleasure, comfort, ambition. He lives with little, seeks silence, and avoids the kinds of attachments that pull him back into the cycle of wanting. His goal isn't to earn a reward in the afterlife, like many religions promise, but to find freedom here and now by gradually letting go of desire. Schopenhauer sees this figure in early Christianity, in saints, hermits, mystics, but he sees its purest form in Buddhism. He was one of the first Western thinkers to recognize how much Eastern philosophy reflected his own ideas. The concept of nirvana, freedom from the cycle of desire and suffering, closely mirrors Schopenhauer's idea of denying the will. Buddhism is the only religion that doesn't promise happiness, but the end of suffering. What this implies is powerful. Redemption doesn't come from fixing the world or finding some deeper meaning in pain. It comes from stepping outside the whole system by giving up the root of suffering, desire itself. But this isn't a change that happens just by thinking differently. It's a deep personal experience that takes renunciation, reflection, and self-awareness. For Schopenhauer, very few people ever reach this level. Most of humanity stays stuck in the will, chasing desires, grieving losses, competing, hoping for happiness just around the corner. The ones who escape are those who, for some reason, reach the insight that the more we want, the more we suffer, and that real freedom lies in quieting the will. This idea completely challenges Western thinking, especially the modern ideal of affirming the will. Think of Nietzsche, who celebrates the will to power, the idea of embracing life fully, even with all its pain. Schopenhauer goes the other way. He believes life can only be overcome by letting go of it. But this letting go isn't about rejecting dignity or sensitivity. In fact, Schopenhauer sees denying the will as the highest form of human awareness. It's where someone reaches a kind of peace that doesn't rely on anything outside, because they're no longer trapped in the highs and lows of wanting. That peace shows up as inner silence, a lack of demands, a deep acceptance of what is, without trying to make it different. It's a calm that doesn't come from ignorance or giving up, but from fully understanding and going beyond the cycle of desire. And even though Schopenhauer doesn't give a strict practical guide, like most religions do, he points to things like art, aesthetic contemplation, cultivating compassion, and living simply as ways to prepare the mind for this state. These practices let us step away, even temporarily, from the grip of the will, and catch a glimpse of what it might be like to exist without desire. When the will is silenced, the world disappears, and with it, suffering. To deny the will is to deny the very thing that creates the world as we know it. This leads to a deep philosophical question. What's left when the will is gone? What remains when there's no more desire, no pain, no struggle, no attachment? For Schopenhauer, what's left is nothing, but not a negative, scary kind of nothing. It's a metaphysical nothing, a state of liberation that only seems like nothing from the point of view of desire, because it lies beyond anything the will can understand. Here again, he aligns with Buddhism, which also describes nirvana as the extinction of the self, not as destruction, but as peace, a kind of silence that isn't empty, but full of the absence of suffering. This idea might sound dark to someone still deeply attached to desire, but for someone who's truly seen, with the eyes of awareness, that no desire can ever fully satisfy, this kind of nothing doesn't sound like death. It sounds like freedom. Denying the will isn't running from life. It's going beyond life as suffering. It's not destruction, it's transformation. A step beyond the human condition towards something we can't fully describe, but can sense as peace without need. In a philosophical world dominated by ideas like reason, progress, freedom, and self-fulfillment, Arthur Schopenhauer took a surprising step. He placed suffering at the heart of existence, and not as a moral problem or a psychological obstacle, but as the very structure of being. In doing so, he distanced himself from most Western philosophers and moved closer to a tradition that, at the time, was still little known in Europe: Buddhism. Schopenhauer was one of the first Western philosophers to recognize that Eastern thought, especially Buddhism and Hinduism, had a kind of metaphysical depth that could match, or even surpass, that of European philosophy. Instead of dismissing these teachings as exotic or mystical, he studied them with respect and boldly integrated them into his own system of thought. Eastern philosophy, especially Buddhism, deserves credit for recognizing suffering as the essence of life, a truth European philosophy ignored for centuries. In Buddhism, life is defined by dukkha, a term often translated as suffering, but with a broader meaning: dissatisfaction, impermanence, existential discomfort. From the moment we're born, we're filled with longing, fear, loss, and desire. Nothing lasts. Nothing fully satisfies. Nothing is exactly what we hoped it would be. This view closely echoes Schopenhauer's philosophy. For him, to live is to be under the rule of the will, a blind, irrational force that always wants something and, because of that, is never at peace. The will can never be fully satisfied. Even when a desire is fulfilled, a new one quickly appears. This endless cycle of craving and disappointment creates a constant state of suffering, very similar to the Buddhist concept of samsara, the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth driven by the thirst for existence. The similarities between Schopenhauer and Buddhism are not superficial. Both see suffering not as a random event, but as a core element of life, and both teach that freedom, or redemption, comes only from extinguishing desire. In Buddhism, this is called nirvana. For Schopenhauer, it's the denial of the will. This connection wasn't accidental. Schopenhauer had access to early Western translations of Eastern texts, especially the Hindu Upanishads, Vedanta, and some basic versions of Buddhist writings. He didn't know the original languages or have direct contact with Eastern teachers, but his philosophical instincts led him to see a deep harmony between his own ideas and those of Asian traditions. What makes this even more remarkable is the historical context. In 19th century Europe, most philosophers still believed in rational progress, redemption through knowledge, or moral development of the self. Kant believed reason and duty could lead to freedom. Hegel believed the absolute spirit revealed itself through history. Schopenhauer, quietly and subversively, said, "Peace is not found in progress. It's found in renunciation." This renunciation is not a dark rejection of life. It's a form of transcendence. In Buddhism, when someone understands the truth of suffering, the first noble truth, sees that its source is desire, second, and realizes that it can be ended, third, they begin walking the path of liberation, fourth. Schopenhauer's system mirrors this structure. The world is suffering. Suffering comes from the will, desire. Peace lies in denying that will. The path is asceticism, contemplation, and compassion. It's striking how two philosophies from completely different cultural backgrounds arrive at such similar conclusions. Both reject the idea of a solid self, a personal mission of fulfillment, or salvation coming from outside. Instead, they offer an inner journey, a process of letting go of the ego and detaching from desire. Still, there are important differences. Buddhism is a living tradition, with spiritual practices, ethical communities, and clear teachings like meditation, monastic vows, and the study of sutras. Schopenhauer's path is more solitary, quiet, and intellectual. His liberation is a personal act, often contemplative, found through inward renunciation, not necessarily through rituals or community practices. Even so, Schopenhauer saw Buddhism as a model of wisdom that the West had lost. While Europe tried to save humanity through reason, science, or theistic faith, the East acknowledged a deeper truth. Suffering is inevitable, but freedom is possible for those who let go of desire. Buddhism is 1,000 times more reasonable than Christianity. It doesn't promise eternal salvation. It promises the end of suffering. Schopenhauer, in a critique of Christian optimism. This criticism wasn't just for shock value. Schopenhauer deeply opposed any belief system that, in his view, sold comfort in exchange for submission. He believed religions that put the meaning of life in some future paradise only made desire stronger, because they promised rewards to those who obeyed and endured suffering. Buddhism, in contrast, offers a radical break from desire. And that's what drew Schopenhauer in: the silence, the renunciation, the inner peace. No glory, no heaven, no final judgment, just the stilling of the inner storm, the stilling of the will, freedom. This ideal may feel foreign to Western culture, but it moved Schopenhauer deeply, so much so that he acknowledged, with rare humility for his time, that wisdom didn't belong only to Europe. True philosophy, the kind that faces the world's pain and offers a way to ease it, had existed for centuries in the East. That's why studying Schopenhauer isn't just diving into a pessimistic philosophy. It's also stepping into a meeting point between two worlds, a place where Western thought recognizes its limits and bows to a wisdom that doesn't aim to control the world, but to quiet it. If, as we've seen so far, life is driven by a blind and insatiable will, and if that will traps us in a never-ending cycle of desire, frustration, and suffering, then it's natural to ask, is there any way to escape, even for a moment, from this torment? Arthur Schopenhauer says yes, through art. For him, art is a form of temporary redemption, a brief relief from the harshness of existence. It doesn't eliminate suffering at its root, nor does it permanently silence the will like asceticism aims to do. But it does pause its effects for a short while. When we contemplate a work of art, we don't crave, we don't suffer, we don't strive, we simply observe. And because of that, we're freed, if only for a moment, from the tyranny of wanting. During aesthetic contemplation, the individual ceases to be a subject of will and becomes a subject of pure knowledge. For Arthur Schopenhauer, the world as will and representation. It's a subtle shift, but a powerful one. The person who suffers because they desire, because they lack, because they struggle, becomes, in the presence of art, someone who simply sees. The desiring self is silenced. The will takes a step back. And the world, for that brief moment, is no longer a battlefield of pain. It becomes pure form, pure beauty. That sense of detachment is key. For Schopenhauer, real art isn't about usefulness. It doesn't serve moral or practical goals. It doesn't try to persuade, entertain, or sell anything. It simply reveals. It shows us the world as it is, without the filter of usefulness or the pressure of desire. And in doing so, it places us in a state of pure contemplation, one of the few real respites in life's tragic structure. Art, then, works like metaphysical anesthesia. It doesn't heal the wound, because the wound is built into life itself, but it numbs the pain. It carries us to a space where suffering can't touch us. That's why art isn't a luxury or a distraction. It's a spiritual necessity, a refuge for the suffering soul. And this form of relief isn't the same as pleasure or entertainment. Everyday pleasure is tied to the senses and is just another way for the will to chase satisfaction, which means it only leads back to more wanting and more pain. But aesthetic contemplation steps outside of that cycle. We don't want the artwork, we observe it, and in doing so, we stop being prisoners of lack. This effect can happen when looking at a painting, a sculpture, a poem, or stunning architecture. But for Schopenhauer, the purest form of art is music. Music is a direct copy of the will. Unlike other arts, which depict things from the world, which are representations of the will, music expresses the very movement of the will itself. It doesn't need images, words, or visible forms. It touches the essence of being, our impulses, tensions, and inner drives. That's why music can feel so powerful, so immediate, so hard to explain. When we listen to deeply expressive music, something inside us recognizes it, without needing to think. We're moved by it because it speaks the same language as our soul. And in that moment of deep listening, something inside us settles. The pain that used to dominate fades, and we're left with pure presence. No craving, just being. That's why, even though art doesn't provide ultimate salvation, it's one of the few authentic sources of comfort in Schopenhauer's philosophy. It doesn't deny pain like most daily distractions do. Instead, it transforms pain, gives shape to what would otherwise be mute suffering. Art makes the world something we can look at, and because of that, something we can bear. To contemplate beauty in this light is not a luxury, it's a form of resistance, a reminder that, even in the middle of pain, there's something that isn't about lack, or struggle, or competition. Something that can simply be seen, without needing to possess it, and that, in itself, is deeply freeing. But Schopenhauer is clear. This freedom is temporary. After the music, the painting, the poem, the will returns. The cycle starts over. We begin wanting again. We suffer again. We struggle again. That's why art isn't a replacement for the deeper path of denying the will, but it hints at it, as if whispering to the soul. This is what peace would feel like if you could silence the will forever. In this sense, art is also a window into something beyond, a glimpse of the state the ascetic seeks to reach permanently, the suspension of will. But while that path requires discipline, self-denial, and transformation, art gives us a more immediate pause, more accessible, more spontaneous. And even the briefest pause is priceless. In a world that constantly pushes us back into desire, into consumption, speed, and comparison, to stop and truly contemplate a work of art is a radical act. It's saying no, just for a moment, to the logic of the will. And in that refusal, there is freedom. Art reveals the world as pure representation, free from the slavery of the will. So when Schopenhauer talks about art as redemption, he's not being poetic or symbolic. He's describing something real, something anyone can experience. A moment when the world stops being a tool and becomes form. When the person stops being needy and becomes just an observer, pure awareness. That's the greatness of art in Schopenhauer's philosophy. It's not a bourgeois luxury or an intellectual pastime. It's a metaphysical necessity, a way to suspend, even briefly, the pain that runs through existence, an anesthesia that doesn't numb us into ignorance, but lifts us into clarity, that doesn't hide the pain, but transforms it, that doesn't promise eternity, but gives us a moment to breathe. And maybe, in those moments, we find the most human kind of hope. Among all forms of art, music holds a unique place in the philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer. It doesn't just offer temporary relief from suffering, as we saw in the last lesson, but goes deeper. For Schopenhauer, music reveals something essential and metaphysical, the will itself, which he saw as the deepest foundation of reality. While other forms of art, like painting, sculpture, literature, and theatre, represent the visible world, music stands apart because it doesn't represent anything. It doesn't imitate the world. It doesn't rely on forms, images, or concepts. And that's exactly why, for Schopenhauer, music touches what's most real in the world, the will. Music is a direct copy of the will. Arthur Schopenhauer, the world as will and representation. This statement, poetic and metaphysical at the same time, reflects one of the boldest ideas in his entire philosophy. To understand it, we need to recall that Schopenhauer saw the world in two key dimensions. The world as representation, meaning the world as we perceive it. Objects, colors, sounds, bodies, things we experience. And the world as will, the invisible, irrational, blind force that drives all living beings to live, to want, to act, and to suffer. All forms of art, he said, deal with representation. A painting shows objects, a sculpture shows shapes, poetry expresses emotions or ideas, but music doesn't represent the world, it expresses its hidden structure. In a sense, music is the secret language of the will, and that's why music has such a unique power over us. It affects us without needing to be understood intellectually. We don't need to analyze it or know what it means to be moved by a melody. We feel it immediately because it speaks to what we are at our core. Music is felt in the body, in the emotions, in the depths of our being. It moves through us without going through logic, and that's because, according to Schopenhauer, music is made of the same essence as we are. We are expressions of the will, and music, in a mysterious way, is that will turned into sound. Music isn't like other arts. It doesn't imitate appearances. It speaks to essence. This idea even anticipated many modern views on music. Composers like Wagner, who was heavily influenced by Schopenhauer, saw music as much more than entertainment. To them, music was the embodiment of a cosmic drama, the deep movement of existence itself. But Schopenhauer takes it further. He believed that each part of music reflects a level of reality. Melody, with its rise and fall, reflects the path of an individual life, its hopes, highs and lows and frustrations. Harmony, with its rich chords, represents the deeper layers of the universe, the background that stays beyond the surface. Rhythm, with its repetition and tension, reveals the basic structure of the will, the constant beat of desire that never stops. That's why music can move us so deeply without saying a word, because it speaks the language of the will, and we instinctively understand it. Just like pain, longing, or love, music reaches us without needing translation. This makes music, for Schopenhauer, the purest of all arts. It doesn't need form to exist. It doesn't imitate, it is. But that power has two sides. On one hand, music can lift us out of suffering for a moment. On the other hand, it can also reveal the tragic structure of life with brutal honesty. A symphony that expresses grief, loss, or anguish, like so many of Beethoven's works, shows us the will's deepest desperation in a way that hits hard. Music doesn't hide suffering, it transforms it into form, and through that, makes it bearable. What was once just pain becomes expression, and in expression there is relief, not because the pain disappears, but because it's no longer just pain. It becomes something meaningful, something beautiful, something we can share. In this way, music also has an ethical and existential role. It shows us that even in our darkest moments, there can be form. Even the most personal pain can become universal, and through that, understood, held, and heard. Music is the cry of the will, turned into beauty. This leads us to a powerful realization. Music is a mirror of the human condition. It reminds us, without words, that we're all caught in the same structure, the same flow of will, the same cycle of desire and suffering. But it also shows us that there is a space beyond that blind cycle, a space of listening, of stillness, of awareness. And more than that, when we listen to music deeply, something inside us becomes still. Even if just for a moment, we stop wanting. We're not seeking anything, we simply are. And in that moment, we get a glimpse of what Schopenhauer called the denial of the will. So music doesn't just express the will, it also hints at its overcoming. It is both a portrait of tragedy and a promise of liberation. That's why it holds such a special place in Schopenhauer's thought. It's more than just art, it's a path, a way of feeling reality with beauty and clarity, and in that, a rare and deeply human form of redemption. Few topics are as uncomfortable to talk about as suicide. At first glance, it seems like the ultimate limit of human pain, the final break from life. In most people's minds, someone who takes their own life is someone who, unable to handle the suffering, chooses death as a way out, a complete rejection of life. But for Arthur Schopenhauer, suicide is not a denial of life. It's a paradoxical affirmation of the will. This is one of the most challenging and delicate parts of his philosophy. To understand it, we have to recall his metaphysical view. Life is driven by the will, a blind, irrational, and endless force that shows up as desire, impulse, and need. Suffering happens because we're trapped in this constant wanting, and true liberation, as we've seen in previous lessons, would only come from denying the will, not from destroying the physical body. In this context, suicide is not a rejection of the will to live, but of life in its current form, a life where the person's desires aren't being fulfilled. The person who commits suicide isn't rejecting the will itself. Quite the opposite. They're saying, I can't stand not getting what I want. They still want something, relief, meaning, dignity, freedom. And because they can't find it in the world, they choose death as their final act of frustrated desire. Suicide is an act of affirming the will. It doesn't eliminate the will. It only ends one of its appearances. Arthur Schopenhauer, The World as Will and Representation. That may sound harsh, even unfair, to those who see suicide through an emotional or psychological lens. But Schopenhauer is speaking on a metaphysical level. He's not judging suicide as a moral failure or a weakness. He's analyzing it as an extreme symptom of life's tragic structure. To him, physical death by suicide isn't true liberation, because the will, the core of our being, doesn't die with the body. It remains as an impersonal essence, a force that keeps reappearing in other lives, other bodies, other beings. This idea is actually close to some Eastern philosophies, like samsara, the endless cycle of birth, desire, and suffering. From that point of view, suicide doesn't break the cycle of pain. It just pauses one small part of it. In a way, suicide is the will turning against itself in a moment of desperation. The person doesn't overcome desire. They're overwhelmed by it. That's why Schopenhauer draws a clear line between denying the will, asceticism, and ending life, suicide. The ascetic, as we saw before, is someone who understands the deep nature of existence. They see through the illusion of desire and voluntarily give up wanting. They live simply, quietly, and contemplatively. They walk away from the game without flipping over the board. The person who dies by suicide doesn't walk away. They collapse under the weight of the game. They want too much, feel too deeply, hurt too much. And when the tension between desire and reality becomes unbearable, they break. Their death is not a release. It's a final act of despair, not of freedom. Suicide doesn't reject the will to live. It only rejects the conditions of life. The will itself stays intact. This idea doesn't ignore the pain that leads someone to this point. On the contrary, Schopenhauer fully acknowledges how heavy life can be. His philosophy doesn't romanticize life. It faces suffering with brutal honesty and deep empathy. And that's exactly why he insists. The real escape isn't destroying the body. It's overcoming the desire. That's a key distinction, because suicide is still caught in the logic of wanting. I don't want to live like this anymore. Denying the will, on the other hand, breaks free from that logic entirely. It's a gesture of stillness, not rebellion, of understanding, not desperation. There's a powerful lesson here, even if it's hard to accept. Schopenhauer suggests that the answer to suffering isn't to end life, but to change the way we relate to it. Pain can't be defeated by force, only by letting go. That kind of letting go is an inner path, slow and quiet. But unlike suicide, it frees us from the root cause of suffering, the will itself. This idea connects with Buddhism, especially the belief that ending desire is the only path to ending suffering. Nirvana doesn't come from physical death, but from the symbolic death of the desiring ego. It's the end of thirst, not the end of life. Liberation doesn't come from running away. It comes from understanding. It's important to say, Schopenhauer doesn't judge or condemn someone who takes their own life. He doesn't call them a sinner, like many religious traditions do. He doesn't call them a coward, like some modern views. He sees them with philosophical seriousness, as someone crushed by the tragic tension of existence, acting according to the will's own logic. His criticism isn't personal, it's metaphysical. Suicide, far from being a true escape, is just one more move inside the prison of desire. And maybe this is the hardest and most liberating message in his philosophy. Salvation doesn't come from running away from life. It comes from no longer expecting life to satisfy us. Peace doesn't lie in death. It lies in consciously letting go of the demand that life be something it simply can't be. In a world where most people live under the control of the will, that blind, endless force that drives life, craves, searches, suffers, and is never satisfied, Arthur Schopenhauer believed there exists a rare kind of person, almost an exception to the species, the genius. Unlike the majority, the genius isn't completely trapped in the cycle of wanting. He doesn't live just to chase desires, collect achievements, or fight for recognition. His way of being is different. The genius doesn't crave, he contemplates. And through contemplation, he touches something the rest of humanity only feels in brief moments, a kind of liberation from the will. The difference between an ordinary man and a genius is that the former lives to want, while the latter lives to know. For Schopenhauer, genius isn't just a high IQ, it's a rare spiritual quality, a way of seeing the world as pure representation, without needing to own it, control it, or bend it to personal interest. While most people see the world in terms of what they can get from it, opportunities, pleasure, threats, advantages, the genius sees the world as it is, purely and without self-interest. He doesn't look at a flower wanting to pick it, or at the sky wanting to conquer it. He simply looks. And in that act of deep, lucid observation, he escapes, at least for a moment, from the prison of the will. This deep ability to contemplate without desire puts the genius close to the experience of art. As we saw earlier, art can suspend the will. The genius lives in this state more often and more intensely than anyone else. That's why he doesn't just experience art, he creates it. He's the artist in the purest sense. But genius isn't limited to the arts. It can exist in philosophy, math, music, or science, as long as it comes from this disinterested focus on the world, not from a desire for fame, power, or usefulness. The true mark of genius is the purity of attention, not a successful career. And that purity sets the genius apart from practical life. Often he's seen as odd, out of place, even socially awkward. He seems out of sync with the world. That's because the genius doesn't join in the dance of the will like everyone else. He watches it. While others are chasing their desires, he observes. The genius is someone who, more than living life, contemplates it. But this distance comes with a cost. Schopenhauer knew that genius brings a special kind of suffering. Because the genius sees the world more clearly, he also sees its pain more deeply. He recognizes the universal suffering, the illusions of desire, and the vanity of human goals. This clarity, while freeing, is also isolating. That's why geniuses often live on the margins. They're misunderstood, dismissed, or ignored, often during their own lifetime. But their worth doesn't come from recognition. It comes from their ability to open windows to the truth. The genius is the one who says what the world doesn't want to hear, who sees what others can't or won't see. This is also how Schopenhauer saw himself, a misunderstood, solitary thinker ahead of his time. For years, his philosophy was ignored because it went against all the dominant beliefs, against optimism, against rationalism, against the illusion of progress. He was only recognized much later, and mostly by artists and musicians like Wagner. This highlights something crucial. Genius doesn't follow collective will. The genius doesn't write to please, paint to sell, or compose to entertain. He creates because he sees. His work is both a witness and a form of resistance. And that resistance is quiet but powerful. By living more to understand than to crave, the genius breaks, even if only partially, from the usual structure of existence. And this break doesn't make him morally superior, it just makes him a little more free. That freedom, though, is fragile. The genius is still human. He still has a body, emotions, needs. He still suffers. But his soul, at times, reaches a kind of peace that most people never touch. A peace born not from having, but from pure contemplation. Genius is a flash of freedom inside the prison of the will. Still, Schopenhauer is realistic. He didn't believe genius could be taught or spread widely. It's a rare gift of nature. The vast majority of people are stuck in the cycle of the will, chasing one desire after another. The genius is the exception. And like all exceptions, he is alone. But that isolation shouldn't be confused with arrogance. A true genius doesn't feel superior. He feels like a stranger. He suffers because he sees too much, feels too much, understands too much. And for that very reason, his art, philosophy, music, or science becomes a gift to the world. Because even if he lives apart, the genius speaks for all of us. He gives words to what we can't express. He sees what we don't know how to see, and by doing that, he helps us, even for just a moment, escape the grip of the will too. Most Western philosophical traditions, from Plato to modern thinkers, have focused almost entirely on human beings. Man has always been the center of ethics, metaphysics, politics, and art. Animals, when they were mentioned, were mostly symbols, tools, or metaphors for irrationality. But Arthur Schopenhauer, with his radically honest and compassionate view of life, breaks away from that human-centered thinking. He was one of the first Western philosophers to recognize animal suffering as just as real and just as worthy of consideration as human suffering. For him, animals are not lower beings, lacking souls or moral worth. An animal is a living creature, and as such, it is also ruled by the blind force of the will. It also suffers, feels, desires, and is therefore also caught in the pain of existence. Compassion for animals is closely connected to kindness of character. A person who is cruel to animals cannot be a good person. This may sound simple, but it carries deep philosophical meaning. For Schopenhauer, there is no metaphysical line separating humans from animals. Both are expressions of the same universal force, the will. Both are trapped in the cycle of need, desire, struggle, physical pain, and emotional distress. Because of this, both deserve moral consideration, in the deepest sense, because both can feel. Sensitivity to pain, Schopenhauer believed, is the only true ethical standard. It doesn't matter if a being has reason, language, self-awareness, or culture. What matters is, can it suffer? And if it can suffer, then it matters. Then it must be included in our moral thinking, not out of affection or charity, but out of metaphysical justice. This perspective anticipates many modern conversations about animal rights and inspired movements like anti-speciesism, ethical veganism, and environmental ethics. But for Schopenhauer, this concern wasn't political. It was ontological. Animals suffer because they share the same tragic condition as humans. They are born, they desire, they fear, they feel pain, and they die, often without protection, comfort, or dignity. Think about what that really means. Nature, which many romanticize as harmonious or balanced, for Schopenhauer, is a field of universal suffering. Animals in the wild aren't living in peace. They're running, hunting, fighting for territory, feeling hunger, cold, fear. Animal life is filled with constant tension, where the strong survive, and the weak are almost always eaten. This struggle, which some naturalists describe as the natural order, is for Schopenhauer the cruel reality of the will in action. Nature is not beautiful. Nature is tragic. It's the stage for pain without witnesses, agony without language, and suffering that has no voice. And this kind of suffering, he believed, can often be purer and more terrifying than human suffering, precisely because it can't be rationalized. Animals feel like we do. They suffer like we do, and often they suffer even more, because they don't understand pain, don't expect comfort, and don't have hope. Human consciousness, for all its tragedy, allows us to make some sense of suffering. We can reflect, search for meaning, tell stories about it. Animals, on the other hand, suffer in a direct, raw, and silent way. And for Schopenhauer, that rawness demands absolute respect. That's why he strongly condemned all forms of cruelty toward animals, hunting for sport, abuse, or even everyday indifference to their suffering. All of it, to him, was the lowest form of moral decay. It wasn't just cruelty, it was spiritual blindness. Anyone capable of causing pain without remorse, he believed, still hadn't understood the truth of life. And understanding life's truth means recognizing that pain is universal. There is no such thing as lesser pain just because it's felt by a different kind of body. there's no hierarchy of suffering. What exists is pain itself, and our duty not to cause it, not to continue it, and not to ignore it. This broader ethical vision puts Schopenhauer ahead of his time, as a thinker who expanded morality beyond humans. For him, ethics couldn't be based only on reason or divine laws. It had to be based on compassion, and true compassion doesn't have boundaries. That's why Schopenhauer's ethics is also an ethics of expansion. The deeper our awareness becomes, the broader our care must grow. We may start by caring for those close to us, but we must go further. The other is not just another human. The other is any being that feels, any being that suffers. And that perspective challenges us to rethink things we've normalized, like using animal products, testing on animals, or using them for entertainment. Schopenhauer didn't formally propose a vegan ethic. The concept didn't exist yet, but his philosophy clearly points in that direction. Not as a moral rule, but as a logical consequence of the truth. If the world is suffering, and all living beings suffer, then compassion must include all life. To deny that is to reject the deepest truth of existence, the shared pain that connects us all. All pain is the world's pain. All compassion is a rebellion against the will. In the end, Schopenhauer's philosophy invites us to look at the world with more sensitivity, to see that suffering isn't just a human issue, but a condition of being itself. And by recognizing this, we become less cruel, less blind, less self-centered. Ethics doesn't start with grand theories. It starts with how we see others. And if the other is suffering, ethics is already calling us. Few emotions are celebrated as much as love. It's portrayed as pure, noble, even spiritual. Poets call it the reason to live. Philosophers praise it as the highest virtue. Culture puts it at the center of personal fulfillment. Romantic love as the ultimate life goal. But Arthur Schopenhauer, with his blunt and disillusioned style, tears down this idealization. For him, love is a trick of the will. And not just any trick, it's nature's most clever and convincing illusion. What feels personal, spiritual, and freeing is really just the mask of an impersonal, irrational, biological impulse, the drive to keep the species alive. Love, no matter how intense it feels, is not about freedom. It's the will's way of making sure life continues. Sexual love is, at its core, a desire to reproduce. It's the will's most effective trick. To Schopenhauer, what we call romantic love is just a disguise. Passion, attraction, enchantment, all of it is a necessary illusion, designed to make us believe we're making a personal choice, when in reality, we're just following the blind plan of the will to live. In simple terms, love is the method the will, that blind, irrational force behind all existence, uses to reproduce itself. It's a provocative idea. When someone falls in love, they believe they're choosing based on values, chemistry, personality. But Schopenhauer argues that what's really happening is a biological strategy. We're drawn to people whose genes, combined with ours, will produce the best possible offspring, from the species' point of view. That's right. The person we fall in love with isn't the one, philosophically speaking. They're just the ideal genetic match for the will of the species. And that will doesn't care if we're happy. In fact, it might sacrifice our happiness completely, as long as the end result, reproduction, is achieved. This is why many deeply passionate couples end up in unstable or painful relationships. According to Schopenhauer, the will only cares about reproduction. Everything else, compatibility, peace, affection, friendship, is secondary. Passion, intense and irrational, is just the push we need to act on behalf of the species, whether we know it or not. That realization changes the way we look at love. What we thought was sacred turns out to be a cold, mechanical process, driven by something we don't consciously control. That's why passion can feel overwhelming, urgent, even obsessive, because it's not really about us. It's about the will using our bodies and emotions to reach its own goals. Romantic passion is an illusion, a trick nature plays on us to serve the goal of reproduction. This might sound cynical, even harsh, but it fits perfectly into Schopenhauer's larger philosophy. If life is suffering, if the will is blind and insatiable, if the world is stuck in a cycle of craving and pain, then why would love be any different? In fact, love is the most effective disguise the will uses, and because of that, it's the most dangerous. When we believe that love will save us, we fall even deeper into the trap of desire. We look to another person to complete us, to fill our emptiness, to make us whole. And like all desires, that ends in frustration. Love begins with ecstasy and often ends with pain. Relationships fall apart, passions fade, bonds break, and every breakup reveals what was hiding all along. Romantic love is just another cycle of the will. Still, the illusion keeps repeating, over and over, because the will, impersonal, ancient, relentless, keeps acting through us. It pushes us to desire, to love, to idealize. Even after we've suffered, even after we learned our lesson, we love again, because the wanting isn't really ours. We are tools of the will. This doesn't mean love is worthless. Schopenhauer isn't saying we shouldn't love. He's saying we should understand what love really is. Only then can we protect ourselves from toxic idealization, false promises, and the kind of blind obsession that leads to suffering. And more than that, seeing love as an illusion of the will doesn't destroy the possibility of real connection. In fact, it opens the door to better relationships, ones that are more conscious, less idealized, more ethical. Friendship, tenderness, quiet companionship, compassion. These forms of love are less dramatic, but often deeper. They don't rely on the tricks of the will. They arise when desire quiets down, when wanting no longer runs the show. True peace in love only exists when the will has been overcome. But overcoming the will isn't easy. The entire world, culture, movies, religion, music, tells us love is the end goal. That passion is divine, that someone out there will save us. But Schopenhauer invites us to a harder, maybe more freeing truth. Love is just another trap of the will, and until we understand that, we'll keep suffering because of it. By tearing off the mask of romantic love, Schopenhauer doesn't lead us to despair. He offers clarity. And that clarity might actually help us love better, with fewer illusions, less control, less desperation, and maybe with more compassion, because only someone who knows that love doesn't save you can truly care for another. In the 18th century, German philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz proposed one of the most famous and controversial ideas in the history of philosophy, that we live in the best of all possible worlds. According to this view, God, being infinitely good, wise, and powerful, created a world in which even evil serves a greater good. In other words, everything, even pain, tragedy, and injustice, has a purpose within a bigger divine plan, and therefore should be accepted with trust and resignation. This doctrine, known as metaphysical optimism, deeply influenced modern thought. It offered a theological and philosophical framework for justifying the way the world is. But for Arthur Schopenhauer, this view is not just wrong, it's an insult to the reality of suffering. He attacks it with sharp irony, seeing in this optimism not wisdom, but willful blindness. Leibniz tried to justify the world, as if suffering could be defended with logic. Schopenhauer's critique of Leibniz isn't just philosophical, it's existential. For him, the problem with Leibniz's optimism is that it tries to rationalize something that's deeply and undeniably painful. By claiming that everything happens for the best, optimism turns pain into a tool, suffering into a means, and death into a moral statistic. It erases the reality of pain in the name of a comforting fiction. And for Schopenhauer, that's immoral. No metaphysical theory can justify the suffering of an innocent being. No logical system can account for the agony of millions of living creatures, humans and animals, born only to struggle, suffer, and die without rest. The world, in his view, is founded on suffering, and any claim that this is part of some greater plan is, at best, dishonest. That's why he says Leibniz's optimism is a blindfolded philosophy, a way to protect people from the uncomfortable truth that existence has no guarantees, no promises, and no moral direction. The will, the core force behind the world, is neither good nor evil. It simply wants, and as we've seen, wanting leads to suffering. Schopenhauer's irony cuts deeper when he asks, if this is the best possible world, what would one of the worst look like? Just look around. Wars, diseases, natural disasters, violence, abandonment, hunger, and it's clear that this world is far from being morally admirable. Suffering is everywhere, not as the exception, but as the rule. It's truly absurd to say this is the best of all possible worlds. It's actually the worst possible world, while still being able to exist. This quote carries one of the most powerful ideas in Schopenhauer's critique. The world isn't good, but it's also not absolutely the worst. Because if it were, it wouldn't be able to keep going. It's the worst world that still works. The highest amount of suffering that reality can sustain without breaking down. This is a direct reversal of Leibniz's optimism. Where Leibniz saw hidden perfection, Schopenhauer sees only a fragile structure of constant pain. But Schopenhauer's critique isn't just about tearing down optimism. He has a deeper goal: to put suffering back at the center of philosophical thinking. For him, you can't seriously think about life without taking pain seriously. That means letting go of systems that try to make existence seem rational, fair, or rewarding. In Schopenhauer's eyes, life isn't a journey toward the good. It's a constant struggle against harm. And accepting that doesn't mean falling into despair. It means letting go of illusions that only delay our confrontation with reality. Philosophy shouldn't console, it should clarify. And in that sense, optimism does more harm than good. It hides pain behind false promises. Optimism isn't just absurd, it's deeply immoral. Immoral because, by trying to justify suffering, optimism ends up validating it. It tells people in pain, this has a purpose. But sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes there's no meaning, no redemption. And admitting that is more honest, and paradoxically, more respectful of suffering than trying to squeeze it into a hopeful storyline. This critique becomes even more powerful when we understand that for Schopenhauer, the only moral response to suffering isn't to explain it, it's to ease it. That's the foundation of his ethics of compassion. Instead of using theology or philosophy to justify pain, we should recognize it, face it, and do what we can not to make it worse. In this way, by dismantling Leibniz's optimism, Schopenhauer proposes a kind of ethics based on clarity, a philosophy that doesn't promise goodness, but demands responsibility in the face of evil. And that responsibility starts by rejecting all the well-meaning lies that turn life's tragedy into divine proof or spiritual growth. For him, pain isn't a means to anything. It's an end in itself. And that's why it can't be turned into some metaphysical tool without doing serious violence to the one who suffers. Yes, this view may seem dark, and it is. But it also holds a rare value. It doesn't lie. It doesn't hide. It doesn't sugarcoat or make empty promises. It simply says, this is how it is. Pain exists. It's part of life for everyone, and no one deserves to have their suffering explained away in the name of some greater good. The true philosopher doesn't beautify life. He reveals it. That's why Schopenhauer stood so firmly against Leibniz, not out of pride or intellectual rivalry, but because he saw metaphysical optimism as a betrayal of real life. He believed that facing suffering with seriousness was more dignified than dressing it up as a step in some divine plan. And it's in that act, harsh but honest, that the strength of his philosophy lies. A philosophy that, instead of ignoring suffering, finally gives it the place it's always had, the center of human existence. We live surrounded by noise, not just physical sounds, honking horns, notifications, voices, but also inner noise, desires, plans, comparisons, anxieties. It's as if modern life is designed to keep our minds constantly in motion. For Arthur Schopenhauer, that noise isn't something superficial. It's the constant expression of the will working inside us. And because of that, silence, true silence, isn't just an empty pause, but an act of resistance. Resisting the noise of the will means breaking away from the endless current of wanting. Because, as we've seen in previous lessons, the will is the root of suffering. It never stops wanting, always pushing us to chase, compete, and achieve, but never giving us peace. Wanting has no end. As soon as one goal is reached, a new desire takes its place. And it's in this never-ending cycle that the core anxiety of existence lives. Man is essentially a wanting being, and as long as he wants, he's bound to suffer. In this context, silence becomes a form of rebellion. Not just any silence, not the silence of boredom or something forced, but the silence that comes from awareness. The kind where, even for a brief moment, the inner voice of the will goes quiet. The kind that steps away from ego demands, that looks at the world without trying to get something from it. Contemplation, in this sense, isn't about distraction. It's not entertainment to soften life's routine. For Schopenhauer, it's a state of pure clarity, a moment when a person stops being immersed in the world as desire and instead stands before it as perception. They're no longer trying to extract something from reality. They're just seeing it for what it is. And that seeing is deeply freeing, because as long as we're tangled up in wanting, chasing goals, fearing outcomes, clinging to expectations, we're trapped in pain. But when we manage, even briefly, to look at the world without wanting anything from it, something inside us settles. In the moment of aesthetic contemplation, the person stops being a wanting individual and becomes pure gaze. Art, as we've seen, can offer one of those moments. But so can nature, someone's face, or a simple gesture. Anything can invite contemplation, as long as we look without desire. That kind of silent presence is rare, but precious. It's a glimpse of what it feels like when the will goes quiet, and we get to breathe outside the prison of wanting. That's why, for Schopenhauer, silence isn't emptiness, it's depth. It's not the absence of sound, but the absence of inner noise. And reaching that absence is an achievement. In a world that constantly teaches us to want more, that turns everything into a stimulus, a product, a goal, choosing to simply contemplate is an act of courage. It's a subtle kind of wisdom. This silence is not withdrawal from life. It doesn't disconnect us. It reconnects us on a deeper level. Because while the noise of the will drags us toward the future, the next goal, the next plan, the next promise, silence brings us back to now. It reminds us that life is already happening here, and peace doesn't come when everything's fixed, but when we stop expecting it all to be. So silent contemplation is really a suspension of demand. We're not trying to change what we see, or judge it, or fix it. We simply see. And in that act, free of possession, control, or resistance, there is liberation. But Schopenhauer knows this state is hard to reach, and even harder to maintain. The will is persistent. It sneaks back in, whispers in the background. That's why moments of true silence are brief, but even brief, they're powerful, because they prove that yes, it is possible to exist without suffering, when wanting is quiet. This state is similar to what mystics and monks have pursued for centuries. The inner stillness of the monk, the calm gaze of the sage, the deep quiet of the meditator. They're all ways to escape the tyranny of the will, to be in the world without being consumed by it, to live without being dragged. But Schopenhauer isn't offering a religious path. He's offering a philosophical response to the problem of suffering. For him, silent contemplation is one of the only real forms of redemption available. Temporary? Yes. But real. And within reach. Serenity begins when we stop expecting life to please us. That doesn't mean giving up on life or becoming indifferent. It means looking at life with less attachment, less urgency, less illusion. It means realizing that suffering grows not just because life is hard, but because we expect it to give us something it never promised. Silence is the moment that expectation fades, and with it, the pain it brought. That's the power of contemplation. It doesn't fix the world's problems, but it dissolves the inner structure that makes them unbearable. Because when we stop needing everything to be different, we start seeing what already is, and maybe even making peace with it. In that sense, silence isn't just relief, it's a revolution, an internal revolution against the will, a moment where we say, without saying a word, I don't want anymore, I just am. And to simply be, without wanting, that may be the closest thing to freedom we'll ever know. Since ancient times, one of the most cherished beliefs in Western thought has been the idea that humans are free to choose, that we are, at our core, rational agents capable of directing our own lives. This belief forms the foundation of morality, religion, law, and even our modern concept of the individual. But Arthur Schopenhauer, through his brutally honest philosophy, challenged this idea head-on. To him, free will is an illusion, a powerful, seductive illusion, and above all, one that serves the system of the will. Because believing that we choose freely keeps us trapped in a machine of guilt, pride, expectations, and frustration. By exposing this illusion, Schopenhauer not only questions the entire Western philosophical tradition, but also reveals the structure behind human suffering. A man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills. This short, clear sentence captures the core of his view. We can act according to our desires, but we don't choose those desires. They arise within us, push us, pull us. We think we're the authors of our wants, but in truth, we're instruments of the will, that irrational, impersonal, relentless force that drives all of reality. This idea completely contradicts the common belief in freedom as self-determination. For Schopenhauer, what we call the self, the identity that thinks it's in control, is just a surface-level expression of the will acting through a body. Desire arises, the mind justifies it, and then we act. But the source of it all lies beyond reason, in the will itself. And this has serious consequences. If we don't choose our desires, our impulses, or even our deepest tendencies, then the traditional concept of moral responsibility begins to crack. How can we blame someone for acting on something they didn't choose? How can we praise someone for doing good if their action wasn't truly free, but was shaped by their nature, temperament, and past? All things they never had control over. Schopenhauer doesn't deny that legal or social responsibility exists. He knows societies need rules to function. But on a metaphysical level, he's clear. Free will doesn't exist. The desire that drives us is not something we chose. And as long as we believe it is, we'll stay stuck in the cycle of suffering. Because suffering, as we've seen, begins with desire. And desire comes from the will. And the will is not under our control. It controls us. It moves through us. It defines us. Free will would mean the ability to say no to the will. But according to Schopenhauer, that ability is a fantasy. Even when we think we're choosing rationally, picking a career, a partner, a lifestyle, our choices are always shaped by inner forces we don't control. Our temperament, our sensitivity, our traumas, our preferences, all of it shapes our decisions. Reason steps in afterward to explain and justify what was already decided on a deeper level. This criticism of free will echoes in today's science, especially neuroscience, which shows that decisions begin forming in the brain before we're even aware of them. But Schopenhauer saw this coming back in the 1800s, not as scientific data, but as philosophical truth. We don't choose our will. The will chooses us. And this feeds the cycle of suffering. Because the more we believe we're freely choosing, the more we blame ourselves for our failures. The more frustrated we get with our limits. the more we compare ourselves to others. Free will feeds the illusion that we could have done things differently. And that illusion keeps us from truly understanding the human condition. Belief in free will is the religion of guilt. But if we're not free to want what we want, is there any kind of freedom left? For Schopenhauer, yes, but not the kind we usually imagine. Real freedom doesn't come from choosing. It comes from denying the will. That denial, as we saw in the lesson on asceticism, is the only real path to redemption. We can't choose what we want, but we can, through clarity and spiritual effort, stop wanting. And that stopping isn't just another choice. It's a transformation, a deep, quiet, almost mystical renunciation. It's the move that leads someone from being a slave to desire toward the peace of contemplation. It's the path of the ascetic, the sage, the great artist. Not freedom in the usual sense, but freedom from the illusion of freedom. Because, paradoxically, real freedom begins when we stop believing we're free. When we stop blaming ourselves, stop comparing, stop demanding the impossible, and start looking at who we really are with more compassion. That compassion isn't about being soft. It's about recognition, recognizing the tragic nature of existence. And that recognition doesn't lead to despair like people often think. It leads to deep acceptance. Because when we stop fighting the flow of the will or stop identifying with it, we begin to notice that, yes, there are moments of stillness, moments when the will goes quiet. And in those moments, real freedom appears. Freedom doesn't mean wanting something different. It means not wanting any more. This idea of freedom lines up closely with Eastern traditions, especially Buddhism, which also teaches that desire is the root of suffering and that liberation comes from ending that desire. Schopenhauer saw this as a wiser and more honest approach than the Western belief in free will. It doesn't sell false hope. It offers a real path toward relief. That's why the illusion of free will isn't just a philosophical mistake. It's a psychological trap. It's the source of a lot of unnecessary pain. Letting go of it doesn't make us passive. It helps us see human life more clearly and live with more empathy, calm, and self-awareness. Freedom, then, isn't about the choices we make. It's about the clarity with which we see the structure of wanting. And that clarity, while rare, is possible. It begins the moment we stop lying to ourselves about control and start facing with humility the mystery of the will. In almost every cultural tradition, the idea of nothing is met with fear, rejection, or suspicion. Nothingness is usually seen as absence, emptiness, loss, or death, a threat to being, identity, and existence itself. But Arthur Schopenhauer, in line with his radical view of life and suffering, offers a completely different perspective. For him, nothingness is not something to fear, it's the only real escape. The key to this idea lies in his pessimistic view of reality. As we've seen throughout this series, Schopenhauer believed life is suffering. The world is driven by a blind, endless, and insatiable will, a force that makes us desire endlessly, and because of that, condemns us to constant pain. If desire is the root of all suffering, then the path to salvation isn't fulfilling our desires, it's ending the desire itself. And that's where the idea of nothing comes in. To deny the will, that fundamental drive that ties us to the cycle of suffering, is, in the end, to deny being as an expression of that will. It's not just about giving up specific wants, it's about letting go of the urge to keep existing as a willing being. To reason, this may sound like self-annihilation, but to Schopenhauer, it's not a loss, it's liberation. The end of the will is the end of pain, and the end of pain is the highest good. The denial of the will to live is the denial of the world, and that denial is salvation. Arthur Schopenhauer, the world as will and representation. But what remains when the will goes quiet? What's on the other side of that denial? For Schopenhauer, there's no heaven, no new life, no reward. There is nothing. But it's a nothing that isn't emptiness. it's transcendence. A nothingness that isn't a void, it's fullness without pain. A nothingness that isn't punishment, it's redemption. This idea is directly influenced by Eastern traditions, especially Buddhism, which Schopenhauer admired deeply. In Buddhism, nirvana isn't a place or a blissful state. It's the end of craving. And ending craving means ending suffering. In that sense, nirvana is nothingness, but nothingness as peace. Schopenhauer adopts this logic and weaves it into his own metaphysics. Freeing ourselves from the will is freeing ourselves from the world as a representation driven by desire. This includes a kind of dissolution of the self that wants, suffers, struggles. It disappears. What's left? A kind of metaphysical silence, a total stillness, something that language can't describe, but that philosophy can sense. Nothingness as rest. For the one who has negated the will, the world, as appearance, ceases to exist. And what remains? Nothing except peace. It's important to understand that this nothing shouldn't be confused with shallow nihilism. Schopenhauer isn't saying that life is meaningless in a cynical or destructive way. He's saying something more subtle and profound, that life, driven by the will, does have a meaning, and that meaning is suffering. So the real path isn't to search for new meanings within the cycle of desire, but to leave the cycle behind, to break it, to overcome it. And when the cycle is broken, there's no more desire, no more pain, no more time, no more ego. There is only nothing, but that nothing, far from being a dark abyss, is a kind of relief. It's the end of tension, the end of anxiety, the end of the restless energy that defines conscious life. That's why it's called the highest good. Not because it's something positive, but because it's the absence of the negative. Here, Schopenhauer directly challenges the entire Western tradition, which has always tried to affirm being and reject nothingness. From Parmenides and Plato to Hegel and modern thinkers, nothing was feared, dismissed, or ignored. But Schopenhauer flips the script. It's being, as willing existence, that must be let go of. Desire must be overcome. And what remains when desire fades is what we call nothing, but a kind of nothing that sets us free. This is a quiet revolution in thought, because for the first time in Western philosophy, nothingness stops being a threat and becomes salvation. Not salvation as fulfillment, but as the end of suffering. Not liberation as conquest, but as surrender. The highest good isn't in having, it's in ceasing to want. This changes everything. It changes how we see death, for example. If life is suffering, and if nothingness is the absence of suffering, then death doesn't have to be feared, not as a tragic end, but as a peaceful release. This doesn't mean we should seek death, as we saw in the lesson on suicide, but it does mean that accepting death can be a form of wisdom. The same goes for spirituality. Instead of imagining heavens, rewards, or eternal bliss, true spirituality, for Schopenhauer, is about quieting the will. And this can begin while we're still alive, through contemplation, asceticism, and compassion. Every time we want less, demand less, and cling less, we move closer to nothing, and therefore closer to freedom. This may sound bleak to many people. After all, we've been raised to chase more out of life, more experiences, more achievements, more meaning. But Schopenhauer offers the opposite path, and maybe a more peaceful one. Not wanting more, but wanting less, and ultimately wanting nothing at all. And when desire stops, suffering stops too. What remains is what he called nothing, but an absolute nothing, calm and pain-free. A silence that doesn't suffocate, but embraces. An end that isn't defeat, but rest. A nothingness that, far from being denial, is liberation. There's a kind of solitude that comes from a lack of company, and another, much deeper kind, that comes from awareness. This second kind isn't social, it's existential. It doesn't depend on whether you're surrounded by people or not. It appears when someone sees too much, feels too deeply, understands too clearly, and because of that, no longer fits in. For Arthur Schopenhauer, this is the solitude of the philosopher, a solitude that's inevitable, tragic, and paradoxically, also protective. For Schopenhauer, the world is ruled by the will, that blind, irrational, endless force that drives every being to desire, to struggle, to suffer. Most people are immersed in this cycle without even realizing it. They keep chasing pleasures, avoiding pain, believing in goals, in love, in success. But the philosopher, the true philosopher, is the one who sees how the machine works. He sees what lies behind the surface. Suffering as a universal condition, desire as a curse, and existence as a weight with no clear purpose. The greatest gift is awareness, and the greatest curse is too much of it. This kind of clarity comes with a heavy price, because seeing the truth of the world, its indifference, its pain, its absurd repetition, is not easy to carry. What makes it worse is realizing that very few people want to see. The philosopher becomes a stranger among humans, a foreigner in his own species. Not because he feels superior, but because his vision sets him apart. In this case, solitude isn't a choice. It's a consequence. The philosopher doesn't isolate himself because he wants to. He isolates himself because he can no longer pretend. He can't join in enthusiastically with society's illusions, daily distractions, vanity, or competition. He sees how all of it just feeds the cycle of the will, and the more he sees, the more distant he becomes. It's as if clarity builds an invisible wall. He's still in the world, but he no longer fully belongs to it. Conversations feel shallow, rituals feel repetitive, and excitement feels fragile. This deepens the solitude, a solitude that is not just physical, but metaphysical. The more intelligence, the more suffering. The more awareness, the more solitude. This connection between awareness and isolation appears in many thinkers, but Schopenhauer expresses it with rare clarity. For him, the most sensitive and intelligent people are almost always the most alone, because they're the most aware of the world's pain. They see that suffering isn't the exception, it's the rule. That joy is brief, but pain is constant. That life doesn't offer any guarantee of meaning, only endless movement toward nothing. This kind of awareness isn't popular, it's uncomfortable, disturbing, even threatening. Most people would rather live under veils, the veil of hope, of progress, of belief in love, in humanity, in the future. And those who dare to lift those veils are often rejected, ignored, or ridiculed. The tragic philosopher is someone who, by seeing too much, no longer finds mirrors, only walls. That's why isolation is also a form of defense. Solitude protects. It gives the thinker space to preserve their clarity, their independence, their mental freedom. Constant exposure to the noise of the world, to the demands of collective will, can be corrosive. Solitude allows room to breathe, reflect, and resist. It becomes a space of silence where, even for a moment, the will grows weaker. But this refuge comes with emotional cost, because humans are not made of reason alone. We're also made of connection. Prolonged solitude can become painful. A pain not caused by the absence of people, but by the absence of shared understanding. The philosopher knows he's not the only one in the world, but he also knows that few are able to see what he sees. And that hurts. The pain of a higher spirit comes from not finding others who see what he sees. That's the tragic side of awareness. It frees you, but it also isolates you. It brings light, but it burns. And the philosopher finds himself caught between two poles. On one hand, he can't return to ignorance. On the other, he suffers because of his clarity. He walks between truth and exile. Not a geographic exile, but an existential one. This same tension is felt by artists, poets, mystics, anyone who dares to stare into the abyss without flinching. The tragic view of existence isn't for everyone, and it doesn't need to be. But those who experience it, even briefly, are never quite the same again. And yet, Schopenhauer doesn't see this solitude as purely bitter. He believes there's a kind of dignity in this distance. The solitary philosopher is also more free, more calm, less fooled. Someone who, by letting go of the madness of desire, can reach a quiet kind of peace, the peace of contemplation. This peace isn't loud or showy. It's quiet, like all things that escape the grip of the will. It's the peace of someone who no longer needs to prove anything, win anything, or own anything. In this way, solitude becomes the soil where clarity grows, and those who embrace it, even with pain, become the guardians of a truth the world is trying to forget. The solitude of the wise is not despair. It's the space where truth lives. In the end, Schopenhauer's philosophy doesn't ask us to seek isolation. It asks us to understand it. To recognize that in a world ruled by blind will, seeing clearly almost always means stepping back. And that stepping back isn't a rejection of life. It's resistance to a life without awareness. Solitude, when it's born from tragic consciousness, is not emptiness. It's clarity. And clarity, even when it hurts, is one of the noblest paths a person can take. We've reached the end of this deep journey through Schopenhauer's ideas. If you've made it this far, it means that something inside you, maybe a sense of restlessness, a search for meaning, or a desire for clarity, resonated with these reflections. And for that, I want to sincerely thank you. Your presence here gives real purpose to this space. Now, if these ideas spoke to you in any way, don't forget to like this video. It really helps the channel grow and keeps content like this coming your way. Share it with someone who might need to hear these words. Maybe you are the connection someone's been waiting for, to see life from a new perspective. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any upcoming episodes. There's still so much more to explore. New philosophies, other thinkers, and different ways of looking at the world with depth and courage. And of course, drop a comment below. I'd love to know what touched you the most in this series. What challenged you, what made you reflect, and what Schopenhauer continues to make you think about. The conversation keeps going in the comments, and your voice matters. Here's my invitation to you. Stay on the channel, explore the other videos, dive into more ideas. Philosophy doesn't really end. It begins with every new perspective. I'll see you in the next video. And remember, thinking might hurt, but not thinking hurts much more.